December 16, 1942. On the right bank of the Don, an Italian infantryman is crouched in a trench that is too shallow because the ground has frozen harder than the shovel. His greatcoat was issued for a war that was supposed to move south. His boots were never meant for this cold. 100 yards behind him, 4 men stand around a 47mm anti-tank gun. Across the river, engines are coming closer. That gun could defeat a little more than 2 inches of armor at very close range. The front of the Soviet T-34 presented something closer to 3.5 inches of effective protection. The men in the trench did not need a staff college to understand the equation. 15 days later, most of the Italian 8th Army had ceased to exist as a connected fighting force. 6 weeks after that, its last organized corps would smash through a Soviet roadblock behind only 3 German assault guns, dragging a column of roughly 40,000 survivors west through the snow. But the destruction of Mussolini's army was not only an Italian disaster. It opened the road that forced Germany to abandon the relief of Stalingrad. And that is the part of the story most people miss. Italy had entered the war in the Soviet Union with a force of about 60,000 men under General Giovanni Messi. By the standards of what followed, that first commitment was limited, mobile enough to function, and at least partly matched to its mission. Mess believed any expansion should wait until Italy could supply modern weapons, transport, and winter equipment. Rome expanded anyway. In July 1942, the Expeditionary Corps became the Italian 8th Army. General Italo Garibaldi took command, and in roughly 5 months, the Italian presence in Russia grew from about 60,000 men to roughly 235,000. The manpower multiplied. The supporting system did not. By late 1942, the Army had around 17,000 motor vehicles and 25,000 horses. More horses than trucks. That was not an antique detail. It was the speed limit of the Army. When roads dissolved into mud, when fuel ran short, or when Soviet armor appeared behind the line, a large part of the Italian force could only move as fast as exhausted men and pack animals. The winter clothing shortage made the problem worse. Cold was not merely discomfort. Cold reduced marching speed. It damaged weapons. It killed men who survived the battle and then had to walk. Garibaldi also inherited a front he did not choose. His army was spread along roughly 168 miles of the Don. 12 divisions were expected to cover that distance. On average, each division held about 14 miles. There was no deep reserve behind them large enough to repair a major breakthrough. There was no thick belt of defenses, and in several sectors the river line depended on thin infantry positions, small artillery groups, and anti-tank guns designed before the T-34 existed. The standard Italian weapon was the Cannoni da 4732. It was light, it was easy to move. Against older tanks it could be dangerous. Against the frontal armor of a T-34 it was usually a warning shot. A weapon that could penetrate a little over 2 inches at close range was being asked to stop a sloped plate that behaved more like 3.5. The closer the tank came, the more clearly the gun crew could see the problem, and the fewer options they had left. None of this meant the Italian army had never fought well. Earlier in 1942, its troops had cleared a Soviet bridgehead at Serafimovich. They had also helped repel a major Soviet attack on the Don with German armored support. The army that broke in December was not untouched by combat. It had already held the river once. What changed was the scale of the blow and the emptiness behind the line. The first strike came on December 11. Soviet forces attacked the sector held by the Ravenna and Cosseria divisions. T-34s and aircraft tested the line for 5 days. Then on December 16, Operation Little Saturn began. That distinction matters. The attack of the 11th was the probe. The offensive of the 16th was the rupture. Little Saturn was itself a reduced plan. The original Soviet concept had aimed much farther south toward Rostov, threatening to cut off the entire German southern wing. The revised operation was narrower, but still powerful enough to tear apart the Axis forces on the Middle Don. The main weight struck from the Soviet bridgehead near Maman. In the decisive sector, 15 Soviet divisions and at least 100 tanks hit the Ravenna and Cosseria. Local superiority may have reached roughly 9-1. That was not the ratio across the whole front. It did not need to be. The Red Army had concentrated overwhelming force at the exact place where the Axis line was weakest. The Italian divisions held for 3 days. Then their positions began to split. Soviet armored corps entered the breach. Roads behind the front became battlefields. Command posts lost contact. Supply columns turned west. Units that had been arranged in a line were suddenly fighting in circles. By the end of December 18, the front from Novaya Kalitva to Chernyshevskaya had been broken into 4 isolated areas. On December 19, Italian 8th Army headquarters ordered the Ravenna and Cosseria to withdraw. By then, the order could not restore the line. The ARMIR was already behind it. This is the moment when the Italian 8th Army stopped behaving like an army. Its 2nd Corps and 35th Corps no longer shared a continuous front. Battalions tried to escape independently. Guns were abandoned when horses collapsed. Trucks ran out of fuel. Men moved west through snow while Soviet columns moved faster on the roads around them. By December 24, the main Italian forces trapped around Alexievo, Lozovskoye and Verkhovskaya had been destroyed or scattered. 8 days after Little Saturn opened, the center and southern wing of Mussolini's army were gone. But one part of the army still stood. To the north, the Alpine Corps, Tridentina, Giulia and Cunines, had not yet been hit with the same force. Their positions were still on the Don. Their right flank was no longer connected to anything. They were not defending a line anymore. They were standing on the edge of a hole, and through that hole, Soviet armor moved toward a much larger prize. About 150 miles to the south, the German 6th Army was trapped inside Stalingrad. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein had launched Operation Winter Storm on December 12 to reach it. The relief force advanced from the southwest. It fought through Soviet resistance, and by December 19, German armor had closed to within roughly 30 miles of the pocket. 30 miles. On a map, the distance looked almost small. Inside Stalingrad, it looked like rescue. Then the front on the Don collapsed. Soviet mobile forces did not have to smash directly through Manstein's relief corridor. They went around it. The breakthrough opposite the Italians gave them access to the German rear, to rail lines, airfields, fuel dumps, and the open left flank of Army Group Dawn. One of those Soviet formations was Major General Vasily Badanov's 24th Tank Corps. It drove deep through the gap. By the time it reached Tatsinskaya, it was operating as much as 150 miles from its own supply base. Tatsinskaya was not just another town. It was one of the major airfields supporting the Luftwaffe transport effort into Stalingrad. On December 24, Badanov's tanks broke into the airfield. German estimates put the aircraft destroyed on the ground at 72. That number sounds modest beside later battlefield claims. It was not modest. Most of those aircraft were transports. Together, they represented close to a tenth of the Luftwaffe's transport capacity. The German 6th Army was already starving inside the pocket. Every destroyed transport reduced the amount of food, fuel, ammunition, and medicine that could reach it. And the raid created an even more immediate crisis. Manstein needed armor to clear Badanov's corps and protect the collapsing rear of Army Group Don. The only armor available was already being used to reach Stalingrad, so he took it away from the rescue. On December 23, Manstein ordered the 6th Panzer Division out of the Winter Storm offensive and redirected it toward the lower Chir and the threat behind his flank. The date matters. The order came on the 23rd. By the 24th, Hoth's relief force was withdrawing. The column that had reached within 30 miles of Stalingrad on December 19 never came closer. The Italian front broke. Soviet armor poured through. A German airfield was struck. The relief force lost the division it needed to continue, and Stalingrad remained sealed. The Red Army did not stop the rescue by defeating it at the gates of the pocket. It made the rescue impossible somewhere else. That is the strategic meaning of Little Saturn. The weakest army on the Axis line became the opening through which the Soviet command reached the rear of the strongest. For the Italian soldiers, however, the war was not finished. The Alpine Corps remained on the Don through the end of December and into January. Its 3 mountain divisions, Tridentina, Giulia, and Cunines, held a position that no longer had a protected southern shoulder. The Vicenza Infantry Division was nearby. German and Hungarian formations on the neighboring fronts were also weakening. The shape of the disaster was changing. December had destroyed the Italian Infantry Corps to the south. January would close around the Alpini. On January 13, 1943, the Voronezh Front opened the Ostrogosk-Rossosh offensive. This was not a second phase of Little Saturn. Little Saturn had ended on December 30. The January attack was a separate operation, with different forces and a different objective. It shattered the Hungarian Second Army to the northwest and forced back German formations on the Alpine Corps' left. The Italians now had enemies pressing from the front, open ground to the south and collapsing allies to the north. The encirclement was almost complete. From January 14, Soviet forces attacked the mountain divisions directly. The Giulia and Cunines were badly cut up. Only the Tridentina still had enough cohesion to act as the spearhead of a breakout. On the evening of January 17, General Gabriel Nashi ordered the corps to retreat. The plan was to gather near Podgornoy and move west toward Valuki. What assembled behind the Tridentina was no longer a normal corps. It was a moving population: Alpini, Italian infantry from broken units, German soldiers, Hungarian troops, drivers without vehicles, gunners without guns, wounded men on sledges, men carrying frozen bread under their coats. Roughly 40,000 people attached themselves to the last formation that could still fight. They had to cross about 125 miles. Accounts differ on whether the march lasted 11 days or closer to 15. The honest description is about 2 weeks. Temperatures were reported from -22 down toward -40 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, every halt was dangerous. A man who sat down might not stand again. A wounded soldier could freeze before the column began moving. A rifle bolt could lock. A truck engine could become a block of metal. A horse could fall and be stripped for food before the body cooled. The retreat was not a single road march. It was a running fight through a moving Soviet offensive. At Novopostoyalovka on January 20, the Julia and Kunins suffered further destruction. Entire Alpini battalions disappeared as organized units. The column kept moving because stopping meant surrender, or freezing where it stood. By the final week of January, remnants of the Kunins and Vicenza were trapped around Veluki and forced to surrender. That left the Tridentina, the mass of survivors behind it, and one fortified village blocking the road west, Nikolaevka. Today it is called Lavenka. On the morning of January 26, Tridentina reconnaissance reached the village. Soviet troops of the 48th Guards Rifle Division had fortified the railway embankment that cut across the route. The embankment was a ready-made wall. The Italians had no clean road around it. The column behind them was exhausted. Soviet units were closing from the rear. Nashi ordered a frontal assault. It began at about 9:30 in the morning. The 6th Alpini Regiment attacked with the Verona, Valchise and Vestone battalions. Engineers and mountain artillery joined them, and behind the infantry came the only armored support available. 3 German Stug 3 assault guns, 3 armored vehicles for a breakout column of roughly 40,000 people. That was what remained between the survivors and captivity. The first attacks failed to clear the embankment. Casualties mounted. The road jammed. Wounded men and horse-drawn sledges crowded behind the assault troops. The battle lasted through the short winter day. Then, as darkness approached, the Tridentina gathered enough force for one more push. General Giulio Martinat, chief of staff of the Alpine Corps, was killed in the fighting. But the embankment was taken. The Soviet position was broken open, and the column moved through Nikolaevka. Not everyone escaped. Not every unit survived, but the road west was open. Roughly 40,000 Axis troops under Italian command continued toward the German lines. They reached them on February 1. One day later, the last organized German resistance in Stalingrad surrendered. The two endings belonged to the same chain of events. One army escaped a pocket behind 3 assault guns. Another army, far larger, had lost its last chance of escape when those same Soviet breakthroughs forced the relief force to turn away. The casualty ledger is difficult because neat numbers have been repeated for decades without always being tied to reliable records. The most defensible Italian accounting is still devastating. The Italian 8th Army's loss table for the period from August 20, 1942 to February 20, 1943 recorded 87,795 dead and missing. Another 34,474 were wounded or frostbitten. Total losses, 14,520, from an army of about 235,000, almost half. Soviet records indicate that 54,400 Italian prisoners reached the camps alive. More than 44,000 of them died in captivity, most during the terrible winter of 1943. Historian Thomas Schlemmer has estimated that roughly another 22,000 may have died on the marches before they were registered at all. Between 1945 and 1954, 10,085 Italian prisoners returned home. One survivor for roughly every 5 who entered the camp system. Those figures are more than a ledger. They explain why the Don never became a distant campaign in Italian memory. The survivors returned in March and April 1943. They brought back frostbite, missing limbs, and stories of units that had vanished between villages no one in Italy had heard of before the war. They also brought back a political fact. Mussolini had sent 250,000 men into Russia to prove that Italy belonged beside Germany as a great power. He had expanded the force faster than he could equip it. He had accepted a front too wide to hold. He had placed infantry behind anti-tank guns that could not reliably stop the tanks in front of them. And when the line broke, there was no operational reserve deep enough to close it. The Don did not by itself overthrow Mussolini. North Africa was collapsing. The Allies would land in Sicily. Italy's economy and military system were already under unbearable strain. But the destruction of the 8th Army stripped the alliance of credibility. Italian and German commanders blamed each other. Italian families received men who had walked out of Russia, or received no one at all, and the public learned what prestige had cost. The military lesson is even colder. 235,000 men, 12 divisions, 168 miles of river, 17,000 vehicles, 25,000 horses, a 47mm gun facing the sloped armor of a T-34. The Red Army tested the line on December 11. It struck in force on December 16. 3 days later, the Central Divisions were pulling back. By Christmas Eve, Soviet armor had reached the airfield feeding Stalingrad. Manstein removed a panzer division from the relief effort on December 23. The relief force was retreating on December 24. It never returned. Stalingrad was not sealed only by the armies standing around it. It was sealed by a hole torn through the Italian line 150 miles away.